attorney Richard
I'm good,
Schoenstein.
thank you.
Thanks so much for being here. Richard, a terrible thing happened. That is for sure. A woman died. It is horrible. But I've got to say, as an outsider watching this unfold, it's tough to not think when it comes to Alec Baldwin's role in this tragedy that it was just a horrific accident. There is no way he could have known that that gun would end up killing someone, and there's certainly no intent here. I mean, prop guns are used on sets, right, all the time, and no one is harmed. So how does the prosecution bring this case to trial?
Well, you're cutting right to the crux of this, Carolyn. So there's obviously no intent. No one thinks he tried to shoot her. No one thinks he knew that there was actual ammunition in the gun as opposed to some sort of blank or fake bullet. So there's no intent whatsoever. The question is, was he negligent or so reckless that he can be found guilty of manslaughter? And for me, one of the keys to this trial is a very simple question. Did he or didn't he pull the trigger? He insists he didn't, and that's going to be a big point of contention.
Okay, but even if he did pull the trigger, pulling the trigger on a gun that you think isn't real or doesn't have bullets in it is very different from pulling the trigger on a gun that you know has a bullet in it.
Well, that's true. I grant you that, but there are two things about pulling a trigger. One, it does have a level of danger that's obviously greater than just holding a gun. But the bigger problem for Baldwin is he has said he didn't pull the trigger. He said that multiple times. And if it's proven that the gun couldn't have fired without him pulling the trigger, or if the prosecution is otherwise able to prove that he did pull the trigger, not only have they proved that, but they've proven that he's not telling the truth, and that could really hurt him in front of the jury.
So there was a hearing today, and the judge ruled that Baldwin's status as a producer of the film won't be allowed as evidence. Why is that significant to this?
That's a big win for Baldwin and the defense team, because the prosecution wanted to make a claim. You know, they want to go beyond just the gun. For all the good points you're raising, right? He didn't know there was live ammunition in the gun. The jury might not find that in and of itself negligent or reckless. So the prosecution wanted to argue that the whole way Baldwin ran this movie and the production was reckless, that they cut costs, that it wasn't a safe set, that there were problems with the production. And by carving that out, the judge says that doesn't go to the real issue in this case, which involves the handling of the firearm. That limits the prosecution's ability to show that Baldwin acted without the requisite degree of care.
We've been showing some video while you were talking of the movie's armorer, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed. She has already been found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Her role as the armorer was to be responsible for these guns, these prop guns, to make sure that no live bullets are put into them. She's currently serving an 18-month sentence behind bars for her role there. How does that verdict and that trial factor into Baldwin's case?
Well, I'm sure Baldwin's going to try to get in the verdict as part of the defense, and they're certainly going to point the finger at her for being the person who's responsible. Baldwin's team is going to say he had every right to believe the other people on that set were doing their job, including especially the armorer, and that therefore there was no way a live bullet would have made it into the gun. And therefore, whatever he did with the gun, point it, pull the trigger, pretend to fire it, is irrelevant because he assumed rightfully that there was nothing in it. So they're going to, I think, in this trial, pin as much blame to her as possible. And I think she's going to end up not testifying, if I understand the way this has worked out, which is going to give defense even more room to do that.
Jury selection set to begin tomorrow. Who is an ideal juror for the defense?
Well, I think that's a good question. You know, the defense wants to avoid anybody who has an opinion about Alec Baldwin, certainly, or an opinion about celebrities or movie stars. They want to avoid anybody who would be predisposed against him. They want to get somebody who would be fair-minded. I don't know that they necessarily want somebody who's very into guns. A lot of the gun people really feel that what he did was unsafe and might be adverse to him in that regard.
And at this point, we don't know if Alec Baldwin himself is going to testify. If you're his attorney, right? Let's play hypothetical. What are you advising him in terms of him taking the stand in his own defense?
So I'm going to tell you my first rule whenever I'm asked this question, which is I practice with the client or the witness. I put them up there on a stand in practice. I ask the questions. I practice cross-examining them because I want to see how they're going to do. In a lot of these cases, you don't put the defendant on. It's sort of, you don't really think of it. You want to keep them off. You want to keep the prosecution to their burden. But I think this jury is going to want to hear from Baldwin. And I sort of think Baldwin is going to want to have his say both to the jury and publicly. And for those reasons, I'm not going to be surprised at all if he testifies. I think it's a real possibility.
Trial attorney Richard Schoenstein, thanks so much for joining me and for your insight. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Shifting now from